Hello and welcome to our Committee for Sydney Global Conversation today with acclaimed author Dr. Parag Khanna. I'm Sam Kernahan, Director of the Committee for Sydney's Resilience Program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, wherever you may be. I'm on Camaragal, the land of the Camaragal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to recognise our Innovation Fund partners, Campbelltown City Council, Dexus, ICC Sydney, JLL, McKinsey & Company, UTS and University of Sydney for their ongoing support for the work we do here at the committee. In this recent book, Move, which I've got a copy here, How Mass Migration Will Reshape the World and What It Means for You, global strategy advisor and best-selling author Dr. Parag Khanna has systematically charted how changing climates, economies, and technology influence where and how we live. Mass migrations are already a known phenomenon, and they're only going to increase. Here in Australia, we're facing an unfolding localised case study with thousands of people in the Northern Rivers region potentially displaced for a long period of time as the region recovers from the devastating floods. Some areas may never be rebuilt, as happened after the Brisbane floods in 2011. As Parag writes in his book, mass migrations are inevitable, and more than ever, they are necessary. In the coming decades, entire overpopulated regions of the world might be abandoned, while some depopulated regions of the world may gain massively in population and become new civilizational centres. Parag is going to take us through some of the key themes in his book, the climate, social, generational, political and technological forces at play, and discuss how these forces are influencing our lives concurrently and globally. He will then reflect on what this means for the future of cities, economies and democracies. As always, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A function and we'll do our best to get through to them. Parag, thank you so much for being here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Anna. I'm delighted to join you. My appreciation also to the Committee for Sydney and all of your partners for inviting me. Going back well before this book, I've obviously been very engaged and very supportive of city-led efforts around issues, whether it's climate adaptation or attracting talent. And as it happens, these are two of the main drivers of those mass migrations. And so I want today in this conversation not only to outline some of the big picture themes, but really to bring it home to Asia, to our region, and of course to Australia and to cities as well. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation. There's a lot to cover, Sam. You hit on some of the key terms, and I'm not sure that I have slides to cover every one of those topics, but I know that we're going to get to everything in the conversation. So thumbs up if you can see my slides. Great. So let me first focus on the kind of global picture and where we stand and why I'm elevating Asia here in the conversation. Because when we talk about climate change and migration and some of the big issues in the world today, geopolitics, we're always tend to be looking at things from a Eurocentric point of view, from the standpoint of transatlantic relations. But the fact is, for those who don't necessarily appreciate it yet, but Asia is the center of gravity for the world economy and for global demographics. More than half the world population is located in Asia. And if you measure economies in PPP terms, purchasing power parity, Asia, as you can see here, is already significantly larger than any other region of the world, including North America and Europe. And it is important to measure things in PPP measurement precisely because our trade linkages are getting stronger. Trade is being denominated in local currencies. There's a lot more domestic production and consumption, and all of the other reasons why we tend to do that. Now, however, despite its size, despite its weight demographically and economically, Asia is not a leader, right, diplomatically in some of the key areas like climate diplomacy, like international governance around issues like migration and so forth. And that's obviously going to have to change. Let me talk again or drill down on the issue of demographics here. Again, when you're talking about mass migration, you're talking about people moving. Well, who are those people going to be? Well, if the majority of the human population is Asian, there's a corollary to that. The majority of the world's young people are also Asian. And of course, young people are more likely to migrate internationally or domestically than older people. Now, this is really a pretty stunning, sort of collection of data points here. If you look at just the number of working age millennials in Asia, it utterly dwarfs the rest of the world. I would go so far as to say, as the title of this slide suggests, if you wanted to sum up the future of our global human demographics in 2 words, those 2 words would actually be Asian youth. And the reason is that fertility is declining. Some of you may be aware that the world population is actually reaching a plateau, currently 8 billion, perhaps no higher than 9.5 billion people. And that already, of course, Western societies are depopulating, if not for immigration. Meanwhile, most of the world's future population growth or current population growth is still happening in Asia. To some extent, Africa still has slightly higher fertility than other parts of the world, but it is coming down very quickly. And of course, Africa's population is not even 1/4 of Asia's population. So Asian youth are the future. The question is, where will they go? And why are they going where they're going? In my research, I've been looking at how because India is about 12 years plus younger in median age than China, and because of the politics and other factors such as climate change and the ways in which they're affecting South Asian countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, whose combined population is significantly larger than China's already, you're probably going to see a much larger outflow of South Asians in the years ahead, and the combined diaspora of South Asian societies will become far larger than the Chinese diaspora in the years ahead. I view that more or less as a foregone conclusion based purely on these demographic factors such as median age, and again, the push and the pull, which don't show any sign of relenting. Now, I've hinted at Asia's sort of incredible gravity in the global system, and I mentioned that Asia is not a leader in climate diplomacy. And yet Asia is ground zero for where climate change will have the biggest impact. You can see that already Asia leads the world in current greenhouse gas emissions, the number of poor, vulnerable people to natural disasters, including things like sea level rise, all of which makes it really incumbent on us, given that the international diplomacy around the COP26 process and so forth has been, sort of tepid at best, right? Insufficient to really move the needle in terms of what the overall climate trajectory is. Now, whereas in centuries past, economic drivers such as the search for opportunity and jobs and a better life, political drivers such as fleeing persecution and civil war and conflict, those have been the dominant drivers of migration. But in this century already, climate migrants equal other categories of migrants in number. And we're quite early in this century, quite frankly, and I expect that number to grow. Let's look at how severe that potential relocation of the world population could be based upon climate models, or at least the challenges that lie ahead for populations in their present location. What you see here is indeed the entire human population. So every person is a pixel on this map. You can see clearly, where the global population is concentrated, particularly China and India, Southeast Asia, and so forth. That big cluster there north of Australia is, of course, the island of Java, the most populated island in the entire world. And of course, you have coastal Australia, yourselves included there on the bottom right. Now, look very closely. There's an animation that I'm about to start. So this animation layers in what's called the suitability index, and what it shows is the degree to which the extent to which places become more or less livable as temperatures rise by 1, 2, and perhaps even 3 degrees Celsius. We are presently on a global 2-degree rise pathway from the 1990 baseline. And a red zone in this map indicates places that are becoming less suitable for human habitation, again, because of temperature in particular, so the so-called wet bulb effect. And then green indicates places that are becoming even more livable over time. Now, this is actually a geospatial sort of map. It's meant to be rather accurate in its predictions. It doesn't take into account all climate risks. It focuses purely on temperature and the distribution of temperature rise around the world. Now, note the irony. If you contrast this with the previous map, the majority of the world population lives in areas that are red on this map, whereas the countries that are turning green are the ones that are really depopulating in light of lower fertility and aging. So this is really quite a profound misalignment between our human geography and our resource geography, not to mention our political geography and economic geography. And that's really what this book Move is about. It's this misalignment of our layers of geography and how we might go about rectifying it. And of course, migration is one way in which we could certainly do that. Now, what I've wanted to point out here is that some of the leading global cities in the world, and there should be a star there over Sydney, of course, as well. My apologies, but you certainly are a leading global city. The cities that rank highest in terms of connectivity for the flows of goods, of people, of technologies, data, and even based to some degree on their population size, though not only, much more their degree of connectivity or their economic weight in the system, are the usual suspects, if you will: New York and London, and Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong, and Beijing and Shanghai and Tokyo and so forth. So the interesting thing is, and the tragedy, if you will, is that our leading global urban centers in the world today are all significantly exposed to climate change in various ways, whether it is rising sea levels or other concerns, but that's certainly one of the primary ones. And therefore, the adaptation investments that are going to be necessary are really significant. And these cities, among many others, really have to be the leaders in this transformation and pave the way for the much larger, or show the way for the much larger megacities with far larger exposed populations that also need those adaptation investments. What I've worked on not only is looking at the vulnerable cities, but also the geographies of habitability, and therefore, you might say, migration opportunity. I call these the climate oases. And these are places like the Great Lakes region of the United States, much of Central and Eastern Europe, parts of the former Soviet Union, such as Western Russia, Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Japan, and so forth. And again, this is just a schematic, but I have chapters of the book that cover these geographies, and Australia as well. I'm trying to look at what the climate scenarios are for places, what their capacity to adapt is, what investments they are making, how it will affect their economies and their demographics, and all really to form an integrated picture of these different geographies. Now, you've heard me use the word adaptation a couple of times already. This is where I want to really focus the conversation on what we can do. Because if you've been following the COP26 process and the IPCC deliberations more broadly, you will notice that the lion's share of the focus, and indeed more than 90% of all climate-related investment that is made today by governments and the private sector, focuses on mitigation, right? Decarbonizing industries, greening our supply chains, investing in renewable energy, and not yet at a large scale in geoengineering, but that's being talked about. That leaves very little capital at the moment for adaptation. And yet adaptation is what we need to do for our day-to-day survival, right? How do we climate-proof our existing geographies and settlements, if you will? So that's coastal flood protection, disaster management, land reform, reducing the urban heat island effects, and even rethinking our infrastructure, how we build, where we build, and whether or not we even need more mobile infrastructure that can be relocated to areas that are less climate stressed. And of course, the final item is population resettlement, which should not be treated as a last resort or last priority. It's just that in international diplomacy, it's never going to be front and center, because sovereign governments, Australia obviously being a very good case in point, are never going to acquiesce to any kind of global supranational regulation around migration policy, whether it relates to refugees and asylum seekers, or indeed climate migrants as well. Each country really has its own strategy. But I argue that not only do we need to make all of the efforts, Manhattan projects, as many people say, around mitigation, we also have to invest in adaptation, because I think, as most people would agree with the mainstream consensus today, we are headed towards a pretty significant global temperature rise. And adaptation is a Herculean challenge for today and for tomorrow. Now, what does all this mean for where young people want to go? Well, there's obviously large-scale mass migrations that we're seeing occurring. If you look at Central Americans and South Americans that have been moving their way up towards into Mexico, trying to enter the United States, the African and Arab populations moving towards Europe. Excuse me. And so I expect literally, hundreds of millions, potentially more climate-related migrants in the years ahead. Focusing though on Australia as a country, Sydney as a city, and the leading OECD countries that have tended to be the top recipients of migrants, they have been able to capture the world's young best and the brightest. So I'm focusing here not on all migrants, but on talent. And this is a really interesting set of data points that have emerged from recent surveys that look at where professional workers, for example, from this survey that was done by a management consulting firm, surveyed 200,000 people. Canada has managed a really stellar advance. Australia clearly has as well. The UK has declined a bit since Brexit, as you can imagine. Japan has gained ground too. Singapore appears for the first time on the list here, 2020. But of course, now we've had COVID. So on the one hand, we know, based upon the last several years of surveys, what talented people are looking for. As I mentioned at the bottom here, full-time jobs and diversifying economies, strong government support, including for their welfare and safety nets, and obviously an innovative economy as well, and affordability. All of these things are fairly commonsensical, but it's not to say that all countries do a good job of providing them. Now you have to bring in, of course, the COVID factor and remote work, which applies not only to the general category of talent, but indeed to the sort of higher end of talent. Now here, by the way, is a ranking of some of the cities, some of the leading cities in the world and their placement shift from the BCG study between 2018 and 2020. Sydney holds steady, but larger cities like London, Amsterdam, Dubai, Berlin, and so forth have very significant attraction and appeal. So this is your peer group, if you will, of global cities that are attracting youth. And indeed, it may surprise people the number of Asian cities and Arab cities that are now climbing the rankings. And they will grow as a result of COVID as well, because of affordability in Asia. I mean, you may have been following the Silicon Valley program, for example, and that scheme, though I don't know how many takers it has so far. But of course, just the rise of remote work has been critical. Here's again another attempt to parse and map out which geographies are, and this is a very recent survey, are most attractive to people who are the very highly productive tech workers, the digital nomads, software developers, and engineers. Canada again #1 on this list. Australia coming in at number 8, right around there with. Sorry about that. There we go. Oh my goodness, sorry about that. I have no idea why I'm getting this call. Okay, I hope my slides are still visible.
Parag, maybe just relaunch them. There seems to be, that's better. Great.
How's this? Great. So it's really interesting. I think everyone should look at things like, again, what are young, talented people looking for? It's internet speed and low cost of living, and the places that manage to have a high internet speed and manageable cost of living are exactly the kinds of places that are going to attract young talent. So I wanted to sort of wrap up generally on that point, because I think that, you know, Australia clearly has strong performance as a talent attraction hub. It's obviously, you know, a very developed, mature place, very attractive by reputation. But COVID, border control, so let's say COVID and border control issues on the one hand, and the challenge of climate adaptation, which is very risky or very challenging situation for Australia, are two things that you're going to have to counter, going to have to overcome as you think about what the post-COVID world looks like for Australia's strategy and for Sydney's strategy. Because the truth is that even though it's a world under severe economic stress and climate stress, the young and mobile, talented workforce of the world has a lot of options in terms of where they're going to go in the future. Are they going to make it, you know, are they going to go all the way to Australia, or are they going to take advantage of one of the many digital nomad schemes in places like Dubai or Estonia or Singapore or Japan and so forth? So given the demographics of the world, the plateauing and even shrinking population, we have to think very hard, every country has to think very hard about how it's going to compete and capture youth in this emerging war for global talent. So that's just a brief overview of some of the arguments, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parag. That's a real tour de force on a Monday morning, and I hope the audience has really enjoyed that. I certainly have. There's a lot in there to unpack. If you have any questions, please start posting them in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to them. So the first question actually from Nick is the question I was going to ask, which is, for me, a sort of unforgettable statement about sort of the need to think about latitude and attitude in the way we go about, thinking about that talent attraction. And Australia's really struggled through the pandemic with the loss of overseas students. Our universities have been challenged sort of in their business model, and our reliance on that cheap labour force that universities provides kind of really been revealed in our economy. But you talk about something more fundamental than just attracting students and youth. It's also about keeping them here to expand the shrinking cohorts of young people moving out of schools and universities and into the economy. So, I mean, I've got a few questions in here, and partly it's about, high-end talent. But there was also an interesting report by Infrastructure Australia in the past few weeks that identified the huge deficit we have in skilled labour, particularly, to support our construction boom, and the need to improve the culture of our construction industry in order to compete with other major markets for those skills. So we've got a tightening local labour market, in that sort of top-end talent you talk about, but also in construction skills, in all of those things that enable infrastructure. So how do we leverage our latitude and change our attitude, I suppose, to compete in the global labour markets? And I think Nick's sort of secondary question is, to what extent is do our universities have a role to play in that, and are we up to the challenge, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, these are great and related questions. So you cannot change your latitude, you cannot change your altitude, you can only change your attitude, as it were. And I think that part of it is policy, another part of it is innovation and technology. So, so I've been following Australian universities' efforts for quite some time to become really key hubs for Asian talent, and they've largely succeeded. It's become a very crucial economic sector. And then, of course, as mentioned during COVID, that became a great struggle. Some universities I know are trying to expand in terms of overseas campuses, locating them in Indonesia and other countries in order to provide that pedigree of Australian education in some of these emerging markets directly. I think that's a very good idea. I would endorse that. it's interesting in economic accounting, education counts as an export, even though it's a service consumed in your economy, it's an export when foreign students come and consume it. Now, what you would be doing is a foreign investment approach, which is more of sort of a corporate partnership model, if you will. But I do think that if you cannot, for political or logistical or other reasons, bring the talent to you, you should indeed go to the talent. And if we look at the growing ambition of developing countries, emerging, I call them ascending Asian markets, particularly Southeast Asia, education is really rising up in terms of priorities, right? At this point, they have, the train has left the station on infrastructure investment in these countries. They're desperate for vocational skills. And I think that there's a huge opportunity to go on site, to partner and to upgrade local institutions, to do joint ventures, to change, or have more flexible pricing models around tuition, to be doing micro courses and nano courses, really redefining, what we think of as the kind of education, liberal arts education that we're accustomed to in our Western societies work for us, but are not necessarily the best fit for purpose for these countries. So partnering with industry to go abroad and to establish those kinds of bridgeheads to deliver that kind of service can be very profitable. And I think that now in the post kind of, again, COVID world, that's going to have to continue to be a very sizable priority. In addition, of course, you want to continue to attract the best and the brightest to Australia. And I think that it's really a both and situation, right? And then there's the other sectors where there are shortages. And, of course, we see this everywhere. We see that this also being a driver of inflation, quite frankly, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Singapore, and potentially also in Australia. So, and I think that this is where policy around immigration has to be a lot more technocratic, right? It has to be less political, depoliticized, and focused on quantifying what the gaps are. Even at full capacity and low unemployment, you can estimate what your shortfall is in key areas. If you look at, for example, you don't want to wind up in a situation like Britain and the NHS during COVID, where they have had a shortage of, more than 100,000 nurses and 100,000 truck drivers and so forth. That's very, very bad immigration planning and strategy. And so I think that to the extent that to the extent it's not already being done, really, again, detailed and almost, let's say, again, technocratic efforts that are apolitical to look at those shortages and where to import them from, that's going to be really critical. And again, your economy is the one that suffers when you don't engage in that kind of demographic strategy planning very early and in a consensus-oriented fashion.
And where, I mean, again, you talk about this in your book, but where around the world is doing well to kind of retain that talent? Like if we do the hard work of attracting, particularly university students, but not only sort of into our universities onshore, how do we then, keep them here? How do we actually make sure they, integrate into our economy and provide that sort of additional value? And kind of where's doing that well across the world, if you will? Sorry,
I was on mute. It's a great question. I think for those who don't know, the very short answer is Canada, right? Canada is a place where the second your plane lands, the clock is ticking, and you're on your pathway to earning citizenship in the country, and you will have it within, let's say 3 to 4 years, provided that you complete your degree and remain a resident in good standing and so forth. And they make it very transparent, very digital, points-based, and so on. Canada is importing 400,000 mostly skilled workers every single year. And they realize that demographic strategy is a foundation of their economic diversification strategy. So, Canada, if you could pick one country to emulate, that would be the one. There's a lot in there. One is digitizing things, right? So digitization and transparency perhaps go hand in hand, being very clear about the tiers of residency are, how one shifts between them. In Singapore, for example, now, which is of course not a country that one thinks of as being completely open in its borders, right? And yet what they've done here is to evolve into a very calibrated and yet flexible system in which you can move from a employment pass to a technology pass to an entrepreneur pass and other kinds of schemes. So you want to have that flexibility as well to attract and retain talent. Of course, then there has to be mobility within that system. How quickly can I get a passport, and become a citizen? That also has to be very clear, so that people can have that sense of comfort, of confidence, that they're not going to invest time and not be rewarded for their investment, for their contributions to society. And a lot of that, everything that I've just said, is more on the kind of supply side, excuse me, of what you're able to provide those countries. And I think, again, it is a world where the talent has the leverage, because there is that squeeze, there are those shortages, and there are, again, if I didn't give you the number before, 70 countries now have these nomad visa programs and these skills attraction programs and these investor migration programs and so forth. 70. You're competing immediately with about 70 countries. And you'd be surprised at the list. You may not have realized that the United Arab Emirates, with its golden visa, is overflowing with young and talented people today that are attracted to start blockchain companies because they've just legislated a new kind of regulatory scheme to support blockchain related businesses, and so on and so on and so on. So you're competing with Georgia, whose capital Tbilisi is kind of like a thriving East Berlin kind of place. With Portugal, of course, you may be aware of their scheme. And I mean, I can't believe how many people that I directly know firsthand who have moved to Portugal in the last 2 years, who probably had never even set foot there in their lives prior to COVID. So you need to compete for every single one of those young, talented people in different sectors.
I mean, it just kind of reinforces exactly as you say, the global talent, the global competition for talent, and it's sort of localizing that issue maybe a little bit. And you talk about the at a country level or at a city level, the kind of decentralized workforces. So the triumph of digitization over agglomeration. So taking that kind of battle for talent from a global competition to then saying, okay, where's it going to be, and how's it going to live spatially, in place in and around cities. And you say that, particularly in the US, many companies would rather pay salaries or offer consultant contracts to remote workers who have quality connectivity at home rather than spend on expensive commercial real estate. And I believe Singapore's even kind of taken a step further and actually sort of expanded that view kind of it's looking at expanding that view into the regions. Kind of people can live, over the water in Indonesia or in Malaysia and still, still kind of play a role in citizenship, if you like, and play a role in the economy. But I feel like, a lot of our planning today is being centered around the economic benefits of agglomeration and, the opportunities that CBDs bring in our economies. And but sort of through COVID, kind of with that, with our probably first experience of cities actually reducing in population, the new demographic numbers suggest that over the last few years, both Melbourne and Sydney have lost population numbers for the first time. And so there's that kind of reinvestment sort of in the fringes, but also the kind of suburbanization. We're looking at the need to reinvest in local high streets. So I guess, that's a long intro, but I'm interested in you talking about the data and the anecdotes you're seeing about hearing a trend away from cities and offices to, Zoom calls and suburban revivals and lifestyle focused living in that kind of, as I said, digitization over agglomeration kind of idea.
It's a great set of questions, and all of those points you made belong together, and they just have to be parsed out. For the first point to make is that it's very difficult to generalize at a global level. We've been hearing about the death of the city and so forth. We know that, similar to what you just described in Australia and the United States, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York have lost people, over the last decade, actually, not just due to COVID. But that does not mean that the city has lost, because in the case of the United States, Nashville and Denver and Boise, Idaho, and Austin, Texas, have all gained people. So the city always wins. The question is which city. Now, in Australia, obviously, you are a very large continent, but you don't have as many cities for people to choose from in terms of where they're going to live as the United States, which has 300 metro areas. So there'll be a constant tug of war and resorting of the American population. And again, climate change and remote work and cost of living are going to be factors in corporate policy as well. Some companies are doing purchasing power adjusted salaries. Others are saying you can have the same salary that you would have if you lived in our expensive tier 1 headquarters city and that kind of thing. So there's so many variables. But now if you look at Asia, by this I mean continental Asia, this is not a trend at all, right? Asians will still flock to cities and to the same cities because the fact is that Asians move to cities for a higher quality of life, higher wages, access to better public services, to connectivity, education, healthcare, all of those kinds of things. So how could we possibly generalize about the how could we generalize about the sort of the death of the city or the demise of the city when in fact in the region that has most of the world population, people are still very much gravitating towards cities. Now in terms of this, those places that already are agglomerated, as it were, do need to retrofit, obviously. The CBDs are not going to be as attractive in their present form, but there are cities like Paris, like London, Seattle, Berlin, that are actually transforming into the so-called 15-minute city, right? That are pedestrian friendly, walkable, cyclable, that are eliminating cars and turning those CBDs into really more open kinds of social and commercial areas simultaneously. So, those are some of the things that I think we want to see, cities do. I do think that trend towards the 15-minute city and the efforts that are being made by some of those cities that I just mentioned are not just a flash in the pan. They're not just temporary. They will be crucial to talent retention and talent attraction in the years ahead. So to the extent, that can be done on the kind of spatial planning side. But let me emphasize just one point again, which is affordability, right? A city that is not affordable is going to lose people simply because people do have a choice today, right? They can be a remote worker in an affordable place. So without pretty significant investment in public housing, public transportation, whatever the case may be, even the most novel investments in, again, in sort of, redesigning business districts and so on are not going to be sufficient to attract young talent.
So, I mean, again, what I'm hearing is that there's a huge sort of generational change in sort of how we understood cities and how they functioned sort of historically, if you like. And in this last decade, and certainly accelerated in the last couple of years, we're seeing a need to really think about our cities and how they work and how we're planning for them in a completely different way.
Exactly.
And I mean, you talk about in your book, the this and the sort of role of youth as global citizens and that kind of need for mobility. I'm going to switch gears here and sort of pick up on your sort of last point around affordability. We've had a kind of a big push in Sydney, but across Australia around affordability of housing and some of the issues around housing supply, potentially playing a role in that, but also, the role of cheap money. Where that comes to a head in this discussion is, where do we locate, where do we provide that supply in the context of this other big issue around climate risk? So kind of stepping back a little bit, you kind of have this thesis that a key factor in mass migration is climate related. and this is only going to increase. I mean, we were talking before about, you know, the fact that the east coast of Australia, northern New South Wales, is currently being ravaged by extreme flooding. A couple of kind of, one flood is sort of 2 meters higher than the historical kind of maximum flood sort of ever experienced. And your point that climate doesn't care about political boundaries is also particularly pertinent in light of a scandal our federal government found themselves in a couple of weeks ago, where they offered flood relief to residents in one electorate, but those in neighbouring opposition electorates who had been hit by the same floodwaters sort of weren't eligible. Taking that kind of federal government, I'm kind of bringing this. I'll bring this back to the local level, but sort of I want to start at the federal level, because you note in your book that the United States, their federal government is taking a pragmatic approach with regard to climate risk. So $500 billion in disaster expenditure since 2005 sort of has highlighted this kind of need to move.
I'm going to jump in for a second while Sam's internet has gone a little bit haywire. Maybe Sam might turn his camera off for a second there. But I think the question that he wanted to ask, Parag, I'm Anna, by the way, hi. We have met, but to others who are on the call. The question he wanted to ask was I think around the point that you made in the book around managed retreat, and he was quoting the line about the $500 billion worth of disaster-related expenditures since 2005, and that now the US federal government is talking about large-scale migrations. So when we're talking about affordability in areas, and we're looking at where people are going to be situated, and in Australia, you know, there's also where places are affordable or perhaps not places where we should be building is a question. Yeah, I think the question here is around managed retreat.
Well, I don't want to be overly sanguine about the adaptation policies in the United States. A large amount of disaster relief spending is obviously an emergency measure, not an indication that there is some kind of real strategy underway in terms of population resettlement and managed retreat. So those are two different things. But on the latter, there are actually a couple of positive signs. So the new Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, or agency rather, flood scoring is going to lead to rising insurance premiums for many people in risky areas. There's going to be a more aggressive use of eminent domain to prohibit rebuilding of properties in vulnerable areas. So these resettlement grants are going to be given out, you know, more aggressively to populations to get them to shift location, whether it's, you know, on the eastern seaboard or the Gulf Coast and so on. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. That is, in a way, you know, those are secular policies. I could imagine them being applied in Australia as well, where you'd want to identify those geographies that are climate propitious, that are going to be you know, cheaper to settle, where there is sufficient local resources, where you can build higher density kinds of you know, kind of communities and so on. So all of that will have to be done, and probably should be done, with an eye, of course, towards equity, right? With an eye towards affordability and equity of these locations. But the climate models, right down to a fairly granular level, you know, are probably relatively reliable and almost commonsensical, whether you're looking at places with highest risk to avoid or lowest risk to shift to. I obviously advocate, though, just to reemphasize, that future construction design obviously be done in a much more light footprint way, in a more sustainable way. And we have those technologies too, whether it's the 3D printed housing with recycled materials, the rainwater collection and wastewater recycling, obviously the solar, wind, and other sources of power, and so on and so forth. So I think that that has to be part of this national master planning as well.
Thank you, Parag. I'm sorry about my internet. I was kind of coming and going, so hopefully I can stay with you to the end. That's really helpful from a big picture, and I'm fascinated by your comments about the insurance industry, and particularly, you know, as they get better at pricing financial risk. Here in the implications for the market. So here in Australia, we've had the federal government step in, legislation pending into northern Queensland, which has cyclone risk, and underwriting effectively insurance for housing that's unable to afford, or the insurance industry is even sort of stepping away. So they're making sure that insurance is available, but at the same time they're using, by underwriting it, they're also, I guess, compromising what the insurance industry would say is the kind of market mechanism of showing where, how risk is being priced. So I'm wondering, again, here in Australia, certainly in Sydney, areas of flood risk, the information is available, but certainly the insurance prices are increasing. How do you see that playing out? Like, is that the mechanism that's going to sort of force our managed retreat? And sort of how is that playing out sort of in other parts of the world?
Yes and no. I think on the one hand, the insurance angle is obviously crucial in terms of raising the cost of remaining in vulnerable geographies, but I think we need to do more. And property markets, real estate developers, asset managers can do a better job, municipal governments as well, in terms of land allocation, in terms of looking at affordable, again, currently lower cost, but affordable and resilient geographies where more, again, as I said before, sort of a sustainable and affordable development can be done. And that's going to be a pull factor. It's not just the insurance industry pushing people away, but the real estate markets and cities and towns pulling people. This has been part of what's happened in the US. Again, some of these, the construction boom in climate resilient areas, such as Boise, Idaho, and so forth, has meant that you have a really significant influx. And they started to do this before COVID, but have benefited from COVID. So supply and demand dynamics, matter a lot there. And again, as with all other wealthy industrial societies, you have an affordability challenge. So thinking about which cities or towns could benefit from a population gain for their economies, and to kind of pre-design, pre-develop greater community real estate assets in those places that are affordable is going to itself be a major draw in this kind of post-COVID remote work situation.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and that pull, I guess, we've seen in COVID, that pull to the periphery and to I guess what we'd call the regions, but sort of within 3 to 4 hours of Sydney, so people are still able to get to the to the city if needed, but really looking at those areas which have a real lifestyle pull, whether it's the kind of tree change inland or the sea change along the coasts. But the implication of that has been, in some places, a huge sort of influx and demand on local infrastructure that is far beyond what the 10-year planning, if you like, for infrastructure and housing and growth. So both prices have gone up, but also just the local services and infrastructure sort of required to support that growing population has been a huge sort of challenge, both to those local areas, but also thinking about where investment happens across the state. What does that look like in the future? And I know there's a lot of questioning going on at the moment. Where do we build the fast rail connections? Where do we continue to build the big infrastructure connections? And where do we need to focus more locally? We talked about suburbs and local high streets, but actually looking beyond the boundary of Sydney or the edges of Sydney and then beyond. How do we think about that? And I know, again, you talked in your book, it's like, how do you catch up? How do you catch up on that infrastructure demand when there's such dynamics, I suppose, there seems to be such dynamics in where people are locating. And so thinking about those long-term trends, what should we be thinking about, I guess? What can we learn? Yeah. What should we be thinking about?
And infrastructure, especially large-scale infrastructure that even crosses provincial boundaries, is obviously not just a local municipal issue, but it's very strategic, and of course it represents a pretty important fiscal allocation that spans decades. So now governments have to be a lot more careful about oil and gas pipelines, electricity grids, the sources of energy for those grids, the location of power plants, all of these kinds of things. I think that that's part of the awakening that I think needs to take place across Asia more broadly. As I mentioned, the stranded assets, the exposure in coastal areas is really quite severe. And again, the irony being this is the region overall with by far the highest level of annual infrastructure spending. So in the case of Australia, the logic certainly applies as well, that one has to think about what's the sort of location of your highways if you're going to do rail systems, future airports, the electricity grids, what your LNG pipeline network is going to look like, and so on, and to where. And this is why the conversation around the habitable locations and geographies, the real estate development in those areas, and the energy system and transportation system and the water system for those locations has to be done in a coordinated fashion. It can't be sort of parallel processes there. But of course, with one we're talking about the public sector more, with the other we're talking more about the private sector. So I really strongly advocate, this is I think maybe not so much for Australia, but for many parts of the world, it's sort of a last chance kind of thing. When you're investing in a couple of decades time scale, and we are in this kind of existential dilemma with climate change, this is not a mistake. This is not an area where you want to make any mistakes. And I think that Australia has it within its capacity through civil service, through obviously kind of, again, policymakers becoming more focused, through the large infrastructure asset managers that you have, such as Macquarie, that are really actually the largest in the entire world in this space, that do take a long-term view. Having that conversation and making that strategic plan jointly is absolutely imperative.
It's such a big big challenge, I guess, in terms of those long-term infrastructure projects, and we have such a both a backlog and a pipeline of infrastructure being planned by the federal government, by state governments, that and as we mentioned before, huge kind of pressure on our ability to actually deliver that, given sort of not just global supply chain constraints, but also global labor constraints, and our we haven't had the immigration as the world hasn't had that we've kind of expected to kind of supplement those labor markets. One last thing, and I come back to this kind of focus on youth that you have in your book, and this idea that young people, we talk a lot about young people being able to buy into the market, be able to buy their own home. And we talk a lot about, we had an event last week with a number of senior economists talking about what are the implications of not, young people not being able to own their own home, and even as they get older, the implications for sort of retirement. But you talk in your book about, actually there's a different way, that certainly in the US you're seeing, and there's a different trend where actually maybe that's not a path, either it's a pathway not being chosen by many, whether they're able to afford it or not, but actually they're finding a different way, focusing more on that mobility and other ways of working. So I'm just interested in another perspective from the US of how that question of being able to afford your own home is being approached.
Perhaps from a US and European perspective, because affordability is treated differently, and it's a different kind of challenge in terms of behavioral dynamics. But one of the things that we do see in common is that home ownership rates are clearly lower than older generations, previous generations, and that's not likely to change, not to a large degree. So I think that means, therefore, that if you have a generation of renters, they are almost by definition a bit more mercenary, right? Are they really going to be committed to one geography if they don't own a home in that geography? And the answer is, of course, no, which is part of what drives the competition dynamic both domestically among cities and internationally that I was talking about. You're seeing a large number of Americans moving to Europe, Americans moving to Canada, Europeans moving within European countries, and so on and so forth. So this is a very live, hot issue that you're raising right now. And while we can see certain patterns, trends, anecdotes, we can't necessarily generalize entirely just yet. But initially for sure. And again, this was happening in Europe pre-COVID. You had a shift towards more affordable second-tier cities, but that's because Europe has much better public infrastructure and transportation and connectivity. And now that will likely accelerate in the wake of COVID because of remote work. But in the United States, it's going to be a slower process because the quality of public services is lower in those second-tier areas. Now, the asset managers in the US are taking a much more serious look at secondary market, second-tier cities and so forth. So we'll start to see a growing wave of investments into those places, but they're lagging behind what they see as the movement. They're not anticipating it. When you're a smaller country like Australia, you can do a bit of both, right? You can genuinely anticipate where people are going and where they should go, perhaps again from a climate standpoint, and again pre-build, to make those areas affordable and have the capacity to absorb young people. Again, both your own domestic population, but as well as, of course, migrants.
That's great, and I know that we talked about this before, but with the creation of the Greater Cities Commission, which has just expanded its remit from the 3 cities that we have within Sydney to include now Newcastle and cities, sort of smaller cities to the north, and then Wollongong, and another sort of city just to the south. We bring in new not just infrastructure assets and ports and airports, but also universities and other sort of areas of housing that might be that are certainly more affordable, but also maybe more, from a climate perspective, better located. So certainly looking at, they've got a challenge on their hands to look at how you, manage and deliver the mobility that you're talking about to enable that, those areas to be accessed from an economic and a labour perspective, and sort of include them within the greater city part, and then think sort of more to the regions, how they work. It's been a fascinating conversation, Parag. Thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate the global perspective and bringing that kind of knowledge and anecdotes and data and kind of trends into our world. And as we said, this is on video. There'll be many more people who'll get the opportunity to access it, but we really, really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Great. See you soon.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.